Well, good morning, Journey Church, and to all of those joining us this Sunday morning. My name is Pastor Ben, and I'm a teaching pastor here at Journey Church. The holidays are just recently behind us, but for me, it feels like it's been a long time since I've been able to be with you here, albeit via a recorded message. Nonetheless, it still feels like it's a super long time since I've actually been with you in person, and I certainly look forward to that day when we can all be back together again. This coronavirus will be behind us, and we can greet each other in the morning with a hug and a high five, and be able to enjoy time and fellowship with each other in person rather than just even having to do a recorded message. This is great for now. It's better than nothing, but boy, there's nothing like all of us being together as one body on a Sunday morning. This must be what it was like for the Apostle Paul, who who wrote and wrote and wrote in the New Testament, and his ministry was going from town to town to town and starting these church plants, and then would move on to the next. And as he wrote letters back to those churches, he would say all the time, "I long to be back with you. I long to see everyone in person." For some, he did. For many and most, I would say, he never did get to see them again in person in his earthly life. And they didn't even have Zoom back then. But I definitely am missing seeing everybody and looking forward to seeing you again. So we're in the middle right now of a series that Pastor Chad started about 2 weeks ago called Trusting God. And so far, we've looked at creation itself in week 1 and how that was a basis for God's trustworthiness. And in week 2, we looked specifically at the life of Abraham and how he built a life on trusting God and was exceedingly blessed because of it. Remember, when God called Abraham, he called him out of a place of abundance and said, go to a place where you don't even know it exists there yet. Leave your life behind and go to where I'm calling you. I haven't even told you yet. I want you to be ready to go. And Abraham trusted God and built a life on trusting God and was blessed far greater than anyone else on earth at that time because of that. And we know the story how because of Abraham's trust in God, God actually chose Abraham and his line to be his special people, known today as Israelites, would bless the whole world as a result of that. That includes you and me, Jewish and non-Jewish. Those who put their trust in Jesus are blessed because of originally Abraham's trust so long ago. Today in week 3, we're going to look at something a little bit more difficult for many of us. And maybe it's because this lesson on trusting God is one that hits too close to home. In fact, for some people that are watching this today, it's going to be more like this hits right dead center in the middle of your heart. And that is trusting God through family trauma. Who better in the Bible to illustrate what it means to trust God in the midst of pain from people who should love you the most is the story of Joseph. You may have heard his story a million times by now. It never loses its power in terms of what lessons we can take away from it. In fact, it'd be difficult to find someone who trusted God more despite the pain, the loss, the hardship, the hurt that was caused to him by his family for the better part of his life, other than Joseph himself. But before we get into Joseph's family trauma, and notice trauma and drama sound a whole lot alike, and you know as well as I know, where there's drama, there's often trauma, and where there's trauma, it's because there was drama. And I want to share a story with you. Maybe you've heard already. This person's very famous, so maybe you've heard the story already, maybe not. But it's someone that most of you probably know very well, and that is Medea. And by Medea, that's his most famous character, we really mean a.k.a. Tyler Perry. So you're familiar with Tyler Perry's hilarious character, Medea, already. I'm sure he's put out several movies, big blockbuster movies, but you've probably not heard Tyler's anything but funny story of the hidden pain that he had as a young boy brought up by the home of an abusive father. Now, before he went into acting long ago, he was simply a playwright, and he was a director in theater. One such play that he wrote and directed was called I Know I've Been Changed. And that began in 1992 running, and it ran for 6 years. Again, it was a play that he both wrote and directed. And interestingly enough, it was a play about adults who had experienced significant childhood abuse, and then the journey that they faced as they grew to forgive their abusers. And this was a play many may not have even known at the time, but this was a play that was incredibly personal to Tyler Perry because Tyler's father was brutal to both he and his mother. And despite writing and directing this play, and this play going on for 6 years, it took him 6 years of this play in existence, night after night, week after week, of playing and directing this before he could finally bring himself to forgive his own father. At one point, this was an interview that took place by a man named Terry Gross, and at one point, Terry asked Tyler Perry about the relationship between his father and his mother. And Tyler had said that his mother had diabetes and was actually starting to go blind. And his father was so cruel at the time that he would take his mother to the doctor's appointments, but he wouldn't actually take her into the doctor's office. And remember, she was starting to lose her eyesight, getting around, finding places. It was hard for her. And instead of walking her all the way in, he would simply drop her off at the corner and let her find herself her way into the office. Again, here's a woman who's partly blind, and she had to find her own way into the doctor's office because her husband would not take the time to park the car and to bring her in himself. And it really hurt her, as it would any of us, I can imagine. And then, as the story goes, there was a time a little bit later in his life where his father was in the backyard burning in a burn pile, adding stuff to a burn pile, and there happened to be some batteries in that burn pile. And he did not know that, and those batteries exploded in the fire and actually blinded his father. Now, this was not a permanent blindness. This was for a short time, but it was long enough to where his mother actually had to become his caregiver while he couldn't see. I mean, just crazy, crazy irony. The question that Tyler, of course, as he saw this happen and he saw his mom taking care of his dad, he asked his mom, he says, well, what are you going to do now? Why are you doing this? Why do you even, he didn't help you. He's so cruel to us. And his mom looked at him and she said, never let someone else change the person that you are because of the way that they are. So he watched his mom take care of his dad. If there was anybody in his life that he thought of right now that didn't deserve that, it was his dad. So the conversation continued, and Terry Gross asked Tyler Perry, is your father still living? How is it today, now that you're grown, you're famous, you've made all this money? What's it like today with your father? And he said, my father's alive, but there's almost no relationship there. But he said this, and this is so key. He said, I still believe that we need to honor our father and mother no matter what our father or mother has done. Think about that. Despite whether they deserve it or not, he says, I still believe we need to honor our father and mother. And this was from someone who was terribly abused and neglected by his father as a young boy. He went on to say, my dad worked, and even though he was abusive, he worked hard. The lights were never turned off in our home. We were never evicted. Now here my dad is in his senior years, and he's unable to work. And maybe before I was able to forgive, maybe at that point I would have said, I'm not helping him. He's dead to me. But instead, I gave him what he gave me. He has food. He has a place over his head. I'm simply repaying my dad for what he did to me. But not in the negative sense, in a positive sense. He's now taking care of his father. He said, I was raised in a family where there was very little money, but no matter what was going on back at home, my mom was always faithful in taking me to church. She wasn't able to give me much. She did give me Jesus. Now, when you hear that story, when I hear that story, when we hear that story, we ask ourselves over, how does that happen? How can someone go through such a horrible situation, especially at home, and it makes them harsh, bitter, and cruel? But others go through the same situation. They emerge with forgiveness, grace, and freedom. One person freely lets go while the other holds on to that bitterness for life and that grudge for life. Similar situations, but completely different outcomes. Tyler's in towards the end of the article, he says this. He says, when you hang on to pain, when you hang on to anger, you're really only hurting you. So the question remains, how do you go through something terrible, through something awful, through severe depression and disruption in your life, but you come out on the other side with grace and love? One thing is for sure, it doesn't happen by chance. This is not something automatic that happens in you. In fact, I would say the default response in us is to become bitter, to become hard, to become loveless, to treat others the way that we were treated, and to hold on until our hearts just become rock. But the reality is, it's not automatic to come out with grace and love. It's a decision of the heart that happens over time that molds us into who we become, whether bitter or whether forgiving, whether trusting or whether mistrusting. So today the message is called Building Trust. And I want to look again at the person, what it means to be that person of trust, not in ourselves, not in our families, but in the God who never leaves us. Trusting in the God who never stops loving us. Trusting in the God who never fails us. So how do we do this? How do we build this trust in him when the wheels are falling off in a family situation? Well, let's look at the life of Joseph and how he chose to trust God in the first half of his life. That's what it's a long story. You can read it from Genesis 37 through 50 to actually see all of the events in Joseph's life. We're going to focus just on the beginning part of his life for this message today. And we're going to see what God was able to do in the latter part of his life because of how he chose to trust God in the beginning. So let's get started right away. I'm in Genesis 37. If you have your Bibles, you can follow along with us. We may have the scriptures up on the screen here. I think Chad was going to add those in. I'm going to begin right away in verse 1 and just kind of stop at times and make a few comments about what we're reading. So Genesis 37, verse 1, it says, "So Jacob settled again in the land of Canaan, where his father had lived as a foreigner." This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things that his brothers were doing. So we see right away, remember it says he was 17 years old, right away, as a young man, we already get an idea of Joseph's character. We get an idea of his integrity because he's already noticing some things that aren't right with his brothers. They're not taking their job seriously. They're not being honest. They're not working with integrity when their father is right there, not right there, watching them. And he notices this, and he notices it's not right. And so we already see that he tells his father they're just not doing things the way that they should be doing. And that's going to come into play a little bit later. Verse 3, Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. One night Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. "Listen to this dream," he said. "We were out in the field, tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine." His brothers responded, "Oh, so you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you're going to reign over us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dreams, and for the way that he talked about them. Soon Joseph had another dream, and again he told his brothers about it. "Listen, I had another dream," he said. "The sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed low before me." This time he even told the dream to his father as well as to his brothers, but his father scolded him. "What kind of dream is that?" he asked. "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" But while his brothers were jealous of Joseph, his father wondered what the dreams meant. So Joseph is having dreams. God is trying to get his attention here. Remember, he's raised in a God-fearing home. Jacob knew full well who God was, and you kind of get an idea of that. He kind of publicly scolds Joseph for talking about these dreams, but privately he's wondering, all right, what is God saying? Remember, this is a culture, Jewish culture, that greatly esteems and values dreams. This was not somebody you'd look at and say, this guy's cuckoo, he had another dream. They would take dreams seriously. So privately, Jacob is wondering, okay, my kid is having these dreams. What do these mean? And these were very specific dreams. These weren't general dreams, Research says a lot of times we have like 5 dreams a night, and we can only remember a few seconds of like one of them most of the time. Yet he's been very specific. These are definitely God-given dreams, but he's only 17. In the scope of how long people lived during that time, that's very young. I mean, it's young today. Maybe Joseph lacked some spiritual maturity at this point. We don't know, but we know that this was the time when God decided to start giving him dreams. These were definitely from God. What we know as we read the story is that these dreams were probably more precursors to the dreams he would have later in life that would actually determine the destiny of of people's lives and the nation of Israel as a whole. But God was starting out with these dreams here. He was teaching Joseph to trust him in these 2 dreams that he was having now, because he knew full well what dreams were going to come in the future. So let's pick it up again in verse 12 and keep reading. Soon after this, Joseph's brothers went to pasture their father's flocks at Shechem. When they had gone for some time, Jacob said to Joseph, "Your brothers are pasturing the sheep at Shechem. Get ready, and I will send you to them." "I'm ready to go," Joseph replied. "Well, go and see your brothers and how the flocks are getting along. Then come back and bring me a report." So Jacob sent him on his way, and Joseph traveled to Shechem from their home in the valley of Hebron. When he arrived there, a man from the area noticed him wandering around the countryside. "Hey, what are you looking for?" he asked. "I'm looking for my brothers," Joseph replied. "Do you know where they are pasturing their sheep?" "Yes," the man told him. "They've moved on from there. But I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph followed his brothers to Dothan and found them there. Now, this is where the story gets interesting. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance, and as he approached, they made plans to kill him. "Here comes the dreamer," they said. "Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." So obviously, at this point of the story, not everyone is a fan of Joseph's dreams, especially the people that were involved in the meaning of the dreams, which was his family. The people, again, that should have embraced him the most and embraced and seen clearly, wow, God is actually telling Joseph something. He has something that's important for Joseph to know, and he's giving him this information in dreams. We should listen to it and trust God to work out his plan, regardless of what the dream involved and how it made us look. But clearly that's not the case here. I mean, sibling rivalry, it's a real thing. I had a sister and brothers. You probably have siblings. We've all been upset, maybe even gotten into little fisticuffs before. But throw the bro in the hole. I mean, I don't think we oftentimes get to a place where like let's just get rid of him. Let's just be violent with him and hopefully and that he dies. I mean, that's where they were at. And so that's what they're planning. Let's keep reading here. But when Reuben heard of their scheme, he came to Joseph's rescue. "Let's not kill him," he said. "Why should we shed any blood? Let's just throw him into this empty cistern, otherwise known as well, here in the wilderness. Then he'll die without our laying a hand on him." Reuben was secretly planning to rescue Joseph and return him to his father. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe he was wearing. Then they grabbed him and they threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty and there was no water in it. Now, Joseph thinks he's just on his way to go visit his brothers. I mean, that's all. He's just following his father's instructions, going to check on them, see how they're doing, seeing if they need anything. Now here he is, and he finds himself at the bottom of a well. I can only guess, what was going through his mind, but he's definitely probably scratching his head at this point, saying, "God, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. You gave me these dreams. You gave me these meanings for these dreams. You seem to be talking to me, and you had a future for me, and you had plans for me that were part of these dreams. But now here I am. I want to believe your dreams, but in the natural, all I'm seeing is mockery and rejection and hate and now physical violence from my own family, my own brothers." And I'm sure while he's laying there, no doubt hurt physically and emotionally. And I don't know which one was worse at that point, the fact that his brothers hated him that bad, or the fact that he just was thrown into a deep well and landed hard with no water in it. Scraped up, bruised up, who knows, maybe even broken bones at this point. But there he is at the bottom. I'm sure he's wondering where God is at. I'm sure trust isn't at the top of the list of things on his mind right now as he characterizes God. I'm sure he's questioning whether at this point his dreams were even from God. I mean, before earlier this day, he's all about God. He's all about these dreams. But at this point, he's starting to second guess, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this doesn't even make sense, because if it did, why would I be experiencing what I'm experiencing now because of them? I'm sure he's deeply hurt. The people who should be able to be counted on and trusted and loved, they've simply turned their back on him, and they've become violent with him, and they've rejected him. And this was not a good place. And maybe it's a place that we find ourselves. If violence, kidnapping, and rejection weren't already enough barriers to Joseph's trust in God, unfortunately for him, things were about to get way worse. And this was not a short story. Like I said, chapter 37 through 50. I'm sure there were times, and maybe it was right now, Joseph saying, this has got to be the worst. I mean, this is horrible. How can it get any worse? He was about to find out just how much worse it could get. His family was about to add betrayal and even faking his own death, the list of barriers Joseph would have in trusting God. Let's look at verse 25 in chapter 37. Let's pick it up there. Then, just as they were sitting down to eat, they looked up and they saw a caravan of camels in the distance coming toward them. It was a group of Ishmaelite traders taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain by killing our brother? We have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his own brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the well and sold him to the traders for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took him to Egypt. Sometime later, Reuben returned to get Joseph out of the well. When he discovered that Joseph was missing, he tore his clothes in grief, and he went back to his brothers and he cried, "The boy is gone. What will we do now?" The brothers killed a young goat, dipped Joseph's robe in its blood, and they sent the beautiful robe to their father with this message, "Look at what we found. Does this robe belong to your son?" Well, of course, their father recognized it immediately. "Yes," he said, "this is my son's robe. A wild animal must have eaten him." Joseph has clearly been torn to pieces, and then Jacob tore his clothes, dressed himself in burlap, and mourned deeply for his son for a long time. His family all tried to comfort him. He refused to be comforted. "I will go to my grave mourning for my son," he would say, and then he would weep. Meanwhile, the Midianite traders arrived in Egypt, where they sold Joseph to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Potiphar was captain of the palace guard. And this would usher in a whole nother state, a whole nother phase of Joseph's life. But here he finds himself, and he's probably saying, what can be worse than this pit that I'm in? Well, how about being sold into slavery, sent to a distant land, with no hope of ever seeing your father and brothers again? Not that you necessarily wanted to see your brothers at this point, but certainly he loved his father, and he had a younger brother, Benjamin. He definitely loved him, yet he has no control over his situation. These things seem to be happening to him with no cause, and he's powerless against it. It seems like his barriers to trust would never stop increasing. And by now, I'm sure it felt like those dreams were just those dreams that he had were from God were just a distant memory, faded into the reality of a very real situation. Where was God? Why would he allow this to happen? What about the dreams he gave me? What about the promises he made? All those were distant memories at this point. Does this sound familiar to you? Have you found yourself asking those same questions sometimes? I have. Have you been hurt by those who should love you the most? I have. We have. Everyone has at some point felt this way. And as a result, has it made it difficult for you to trust God? As for me, trust many times has been equated to a ladder. I love this illustration. If you think of a ladder, ladders are built with rungs. and they're meant to be climbed. They're meant to reach heights that we can't reach from the ground. And obviously, as you're looking at a ladder, each rung is higher than the next, and it brings you to a new level from which you can work or you can reach something. But climbing each rung takes effort. You reach up, you're moving with your leg, you're pulling with your arm. It takes effort. But it also takes trust that the previous rung that you're standing on is going to be able to support your weight. It's a lot like trusting God. Maybe you're starting at the bottom of your trust ladder and you're looking up and you're wondering how you're ever going to get to the top. The answer is simply take the first step. Or maybe trust him where you're at. Maybe you're standing halfway up the ladder. You're kind of looking down, you're looking up, and you're wondering how you even got here and how are you going to go anywhere from here. You're almost paralyzed where you're at. You're looking down and it seems too far away. You're looking up and it seems too high, and you just find yourself paralyzed right where you're at. Well, I want to encourage you, take a minute to look back down. But this time, rather than seeing the ground and how far away the ground is, I want you to look at all the other rungs of trust that you've climbed. God has brought you to this point. Look what he's done in your life so far. Look at the ways he's been there in this situation, been there in that situation. And I'm not talking huge things. I'm talking even the small things. Because when we do that, when we focus on gratitude, when we focus on what he's already done, gratitude takes our hearts from a place of fear to a place of faith. Because it takes the focus off what we can't control, and he puts the focus on all that God can. When we start to look in the past and we say, but I got here, but this happened, but I was able to overcome this, but he provided this here. And we start to see, and he opened a door there, and hey, he even closed this door to protect me here. Yeah, I'm dealing with hurt right now. I'm dealing with betrayal right now. I'm dealing with just pain and rejection because this is happening right now, or this has already happened. But I see where God has moved. I see the little things that he's done to protect me still, provide for me still. And I choose to focus and thank him for those things. What that does, again, is it takes the focus off what we can't control and it puts it on what God can. Remember what Tyler Perry said earlier in that interview? He said two things. He said, never let someone else change who you are because of their hurt, because of what they've done to you. And refusing to forgive and holding on to bitterness only hurts you. That's so key. Bitterness and unforgiveness are sometimes the biggest barriers and the thickest barriers prevent us from trusting God. And it prevents us from trusting him to work in our situations right where we're at. And instead, we end up wounding other people in the process because we just refuse to let it go. We refuse to trust God that there can be something good that could ever come out of this, or that we could ever get beyond what we see right here. Someone said once that unforgiveness is like eating rat poison, then expecting someone else to die. It just doesn't make sense. So again, I ask you this morning, what are your barriers to trust today? Are they like Joseph's? Are they betrayal? Is it rejection? Is it hurt? Is it pride? Is it unanswered prayers? You feel like God didn't come through when you called him? You were looking for a certain answer and he answered differently? Is it disappointment? I promise you, God wants you to trust him today. Not because of what you see in your present, or even because of what you've experienced from your family, but because of who he is and what his word says. And his word says this. It says in Jeremiah 29:11, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. His word says, forgive because I first forgave you. His word says, I'm working all things out for the good of those who love me and are called according to my purpose. His word says, trust in me with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. Don't worry about what makes sense to you. Acknowledge me in all your ways, and I will direct your path. That's what his word says. So are you willing to trust God today with your whole heart, even if it's with a broken heart? That's the real question. Are you willing to start breaking down those barriers to trust him in your life and to let God in your heart to do what only he can do in your situation? Thankfully, Joseph was. Even in his incredibly hurtful situation, even after being abused, thrown into a pit, his death faked, isolated from his father and his younger brother, sent and sold into slavery. And that wasn't even the end of it. He was going to experience more once he got to Egypt. Even in those situations, he never stopped trusting God. I guarantee he had to make a choice. I guarantee there were moments when he didn't feel like it. He had to choose to trust God. He had to choose in what he couldn't see. He had to trust in the God he couldn't see, that he was a God who loved him more than anything else. And because he did that, he was able to see God weave his story and weave everything his brothers did that they meant for evil. And they meant it for evil. He was able to see God weave that into a masterpiece of good. In the end, and I encourage you to read the rest of the story. In the end, God wove that masterpiece into a story that saved the lives of his entire family, even his brothers, and the Israelite nation as a whole. And that required that he trust God even in the bottom of that pit. Even in the place of the greatest pain, he still had to choose to trust God. So I ask you today, are you willing to trust God, even in the midst of what you're dealing with? And I don't know what it is. And I won't sit here today and say it's easy. It won't be. It wasn't easy for Joseph in those times either. It starts with a choice. You choose to trust him today. Will you lay down those barriers that are preventing you from trusting him and make the choice today? Let's pray. God, I thank you for this message. God, I thank you for the story of Joseph. I thank you for his life. I thank you for the opportunity we have now, all these years later, to read about it. Joseph didn't know how it was going to end. He didn't know what the next step was when he sat in the bottom of that well. He simply had to trust you that you would make a way. I'm sure right when he thought you were making a way and he got pulled out of that pit only to go into a caravan and be sold into slavery, he was asking again, what in the world, God? And maybe that's where some of us are today. Saying, God, I feel like I'm going from one pit to the next. And are you really there? Do you really have a plan? Do you really see me? So God, today, in all the situations that I know nothing about, God, but you do, that you look down and see, God, I just ask that you would minister to my brothers and my sisters, God, as they reach out to you today, that your spirit would help them trust you in ways that they just simply have not before. God, that you would show them to simply lay down those barriers and trust you is the smartest and the best thing that they could ever do, God, because of what your word says. And God, your word is above our word. Your word is above all other word spoken by any person who's ever lived in the whole expanse of humanity. God, your word is true 100% of the time. And your word does say you have plans for us. And your plans are not to harm us, but to give us hope and a future, to work all things out according to our good when we're called your purpose, Lord. Thank you for that, God. And I just pray today that this message would sink into our hearts, into our minds, not just from a knowledge perspective, God, but from an action perspective. We would choose today to trust you. God, we're in crazy times right now. Think of our world right now, and every time we turn on the TV and the internet, God, the state of our country, Lord, the state of our nation, and the state of our world, God. We choose to trust you today, no matter what we see, no matter what happens, God. You're on the throne, and your throne is bigger than the Senate. It's bigger than the House. It's bigger than the White House, God. It's bigger than any throne in this world. You're in control. We choose to trust you today in all things. I pray this in your name. Amen. Amen. I hope I hope you were encouraged today by that message. I hope today, in wherever you find yourself, even in the deepest hurt, and hurt is real, even in that deepest hurt, I pray that you would choose to trust him today. Again, I encourage you to finish the rest of Joseph's story because it does have a good ending. I promise you that. And maybe you'll find something in the rest of that story that even more relates to right where you're at right now. I want to end real quick with, before we close, I'll talk to you real quick about one announcement that we have. You've remembered that for the last holiday season, we've not had any small groups. And I want to tell you that small groups are going to begin again on January 28th. I believe the start time for that is 7 p.m. We invite you to connect with us on our Facebook page and also on our YouTube channel. You'll see information underneath this message in the description box. We'd love for you to reach out to us and connect with us. If you've got anything we can pray with you about, we'd love to do that. And that's all I've got for you today. Have a great week. Remember, if trust is a ladder, then keep climbing and go out and change your world this week in some way. Have a great week. Talk to you guys soon.